Aya was sitting in her apartment on the edge of the city, where all the walls seemed to be squeezing and the air was heavy and thick. Every corner of this small space was all too familiar to her, reminding her of the days when everything seemed simpler, easier, when there was no unbearable heaviness that haunted her now. Things were packed, the suitcase was at the door, and the phone was silent, as it had been for the last few days. All she had to do was get up, grab her bag and leave. But this simple thought seemed irresistible, as if her whole life depended on one step. And so it was. The decision to leave seemed unquestionable. It had matured in her over the long months, when every minute with Lucas only intensified her inner struggle. They couldn't be just brother and sister anymore, couldn't live like they used to, without the shadow that was getting bigger. Whenever Aya looked into his eyes, she felt her heart yearn for him, but she couldn't admit it. This forbidden love tore her apart, turned every meeting into torture. She tried to run away from it, but the further she ran, the stronger the craving became. Aya realized that the only thing left for her was to leave, to go so far away that their paths would never cross again. Her departure was not spontaneous. She had thought it all out carefully, as if she was preparing for this retirement from life. Work, studies, friends, all of this seemed unimportant compared to what was happening inside her. Aya has reached a dead end, and the only way out is to disappear. She moved to another city, where no one knew her, to start from scratch, as if running away not only from Lucas, but also from herself. Those last days in his hometown flew by in a fog. Meeting Lucas at the cafe left deep scars on her heart. She had never thought that she would see him so confused, as if her departure had destroyed his world too. Aya replayed this moment in her head many times, his look full of misunderstanding and pain, his voice asking for an explanation. But how can you explain something that you can't explain to yourself?
Lucas, we need to talk.
Her voice was trembling, but she was trying to look firm. The words were hard to come by, each letter seemed to beat her from the inside. She saw his face tighten, as worry overshadowed the habitual confidence in his eyes. At that moment, Aya realized how deeply she had dragged herself into this pit. They were too close to just break the connection. But it was necessary. No matter how much it hurt, no matter how much she wanted to stay, Aya knew that leaving was her only chance to save herself. When she finally regained her strength and got up from the chair, her footsteps were heavy. She tried not to look back, so as not to see his expression. It would be too much. One thought was pounding in my head: do it now while you still can. Aya walked out of the cafe, feeling as if her soul had left her body. Only the shell remained, empty but still firm in its decision. The move was difficult not only emotionally but also physically. Aya couldn't afford the luxury of postponing this decision. She quickly found a place to live in a city she didn't know much about, and started packing. This process was painful. Everything, every object in the apartment reminded her of Lucas. Their shared memories hung in the air, permeating every corner of the room. It seemed that the suitcases she was filling were getting heavier, not from things but from unspoken words and unrequited feelings.
That's all. I have to go.
The words spoken aloud sounded like a verdict, final and unchangeable. Her gaze stopped at the photo that stood on the shelf, their childhood photo, where they were still carefree and happy. Aya sighed and turned away. All this should have been left in the past, but something in her heart told her that leaving it behind would be harder than she had imagined. The first time in a new city was like the beginning of a new life. Everything was strange, and new streets, buildings, people. No one knew her story, no one looked at her with condemnation or misunderstanding. She could have been anyone, started with a clean slate, but that blank slate was still stained with past experiences. Every evening, when Aya returned to her small rented apartment, silence covered her head. It was a time when the ghosts of the past resurfaced. She tried to keep herself in control, immersing herself in work, study, even sports. All this was just an attempt to fill the void that Lucas had left in her heart. At first, she thought that time would help. Day after day, she forced herself to think about something else. But as soon as she was alone, her thoughts would come back to him. Sometimes she found herself looking for his profile on social media, but quickly stopped, realizing that this was only causing herself more pain. She knew it was wrong, but it was impossible to deal with it. One evening, when the city was shrouded in a soft autumn fog, Aya went outside. She was walking aimlessly, just trying to escape from her thoughts. She wandered the streets, watching the passers-by, their ordinary lives, in which there was no place for such complex emotions. People were laughing, talking on the phone, meeting with friends, it all seemed so far from her world. She stopped at the window of the cafe and looked inside. There were couples, friends and families sitting at tables. They lived their own lives, and each had their own story, but none of them was like hers. She looked at those faces, trying to figure out how they could be so happy when her life was crumbling before her eyes. But there was no answer. Aya knew that no escape could make her forget Lucas. This feeling was too strong, too deep, to just disappear. It became a part of her, her shadow that followed her everywhere. At night, when the whole city was already asleep, Aya sat in the silence of her apartment, looking out the window at the lights of distant houses. She tried to convince herself that this was only a temporary condition, that someday she would be able to forget, be able to move on. But every day it became clearer no distance, no new city would relieve her of this pain. Her heart still belonged to Lucas, and no matter how hard she tried, nothing could change that. Aya understood that her life was now divided into before and after, and if before she could find solace in the fact that he was there, now she was left alone with her thoughts and feelings. Her love for Lucas did not disappear, but on the contrary grew stronger every day. But this love was wrong, unacceptable, and it only hurt more. Despite this, Aya continued to live. Each new day was similar to the previous one: work, studies, rare meetings with new acquaintances who did not know her past. But no amount of distraction helped. Her soul remained locked in the past, in a time when everything was simpler. Aya often found herself thinking that if she could go back, she would have acted differently, but it was impossible to return the time.
How did I end up here?
It was a question she asked herself every night, but she never found the answer. From the moment Aya disappeared from his life, Lucas's world seemed to have lost its meaning. It had been several months, but the feeling of emptiness she had left behind was getting stronger every day. He was sitting on the couch in his apartment, surrounded by silence, and could not believe that this had happened. It was like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Lucas stared at a single point on the wall, replaying their last meeting in his head. Aya, his younger sister, the person with whom he always shared his innermost thoughts, just left. No explanation, no real reason. There was pain in her words then, he felt it, but he could not understand what exactly was tormenting her. The conversation in the cafe was in front of his eyes, as if it were yesterday. Her quiet voice, intense gaze, as if she was trying to say something but couldn't find the right words.
Why, Aya?
These words became a refrain for him. He repeated them over and over again, every time he sat alone, when he woke up in a cold sweat at night, when he looked at the empty phone screen, waiting for a message that would not be there. She blocked his number, deleted herself from social media, and left him with this unbearable feeling of emptiness and insecurity. Lucas couldn't figure out what went wrong, what he did, what made her leave. Their bond had always seemed unbreakable, but now it was gone. And he didn't know how to move on. At first, Lucas tried to distract himself, to find solace in the usual things: work, friends, training. But it all became meaningless. More recently, he was making plans, discussing the future with Aya. They talked about where they would go for the weekend or what they would do for the new year. Now these plans were just dust that had settled on the shelves of his memory. The work that used to bring him pleasure has ceased to be important. Every new day began and ended with thoughts of her. Where is she? What's wrong with her? Why didn't she say anything? Lucas continued to go to work, mechanically fulfilling his duties, but his colleagues immediately noticed that something had changed. That confident and cheerful Lucas, who could always keep up a conversation, became silent and detached. He did not talk about his problems, did not share his feelings. It was not in his nature. But others noticed how he began to withdraw into himself, becoming more and more immersed in his thoughts. His friends were trying to bring him back to life. They called, invited to meetings, threw parties, but it was all like noise in the background, unimportant and inconsequential. Lucas smiled when he had to, but inside he felt like everything was falling apart. Even communication with close friends did not bring relief. He tried to explain to them that Aya had just left, that she needed time for herself, but he couldn't tell the whole truth. He didn't know the whole truth. He didn't know the whole truth himself. Time passed, but the pain did not decrease. The expectation of an answer, the hope that Aya would return, slowly turned into despair. He was trying to find her. I wrote to friends, asked acquaintances, but no one knew where she had gone. Her name seemed to disappear from all the lists, from their lives, as if she had never existed. This feeling of helplessness was destroying him from the inside. Every time he didn't get an answer, his heart squeezed harder. It was as if he had lost not only his sister, but also his own life. One evening, sitting on the same couch, Lucas found himself thinking that nothing made sense. He knew he had to move on, but he couldn't. All the talk about letting go and starting over seemed like empty words to him. How can you let go of the person who was your center, your meaning? He had always been sure that their bond was unbreakable, but now he felt betrayed. Aya just left, leaving him no chance to change anything. Every day turned into a torment. He woke up in the morning with a heavy heart and went to bed every night with the same feeling. The moments when he managed to distract himself were short and empty. He was constantly thinking about where she was now, what she was doing. Maybe she found someone? Maybe she's happy where no one else knows her. One day, Lucas decided that he could no longer just sit and wait. He was not a man who gave up easily, and this feeling of helplessness was killing him. He decided that he had to find Aya, no matter how difficult the path was. He began to go over in his memory everything he knew about her habits, about her desires. He remembered that she had always dreamed of living in another city, away from all those places that were associated with their childhood. Aya often talked about Chicago, about its calm and measured atmosphere, which attracted her. Lucas decided that this might be the key.
I have to find her.
This thought became the only way out for him. He could no longer remain in a state of uncertainty. He could not wait for her to contact him herself. He realized that if he didn't find her now, he would lose her forever. But how do you look for a person who doesn't want to be found? It was a question he didn't know the answer to, but he had no choice but to start. At work, he took a vacation, bought a ticket to Chicago, and began to prepare for the search. Lucas didn't know if he would find her, but he couldn't just sit there anymore. There was hope in his heart, even though his mind told him that the chances were slim. He explored all possible places where Aya could settle. I looked through the lists of universities, checked the ads for housing, but found nothing. She was too careful to leave footprints behind. His arrival in Chicago turned out to be as vague and uncertain as his plans. The city seemed alien and unfriendly, and every corner was filled with faces he didn't know. Lucas realized that it would be almost impossible to find her here. But he was determined not to give up. Time passed, and the search remained unsuccessful. He wandered the streets, went into cafes that resembled their favorite place in their hometown. He looked for her in the crowd, hoping for a chance meeting, but she was not there. Several days passed in the same rhythm. Lucas tried to find at least some clue, but to no avail. He was beginning to lose hope, but inside he still believed that sooner or later she would show up. He visited libraries, universities, cafes. I showed her a photo of a barista serving in a cafe, hoping that someone would recognize her, but every time I was faced with uncomprehending looks. One cold evening, when he had almost given up, Lucas entered a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. This place was inconspicuous, hidden from the main streets, and he went there just by accident. There, at one of the far tables, he saw her. Aya was sitting with her face buried in a book, and did not even suspect that anyone could find her. Her face was calm, but there was fatigue in her eyes. Lucas froze in place, not believing his eyes. She was here, right in front of him, after all these months of searching and tormenting.
Aya? Wanna?
His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it contained all the pain that he had been hiding all this time. She raised her head and their eyes met. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. There was surprise mixed with alarm in her eyes. She hadn't expected to see him here, and her reaction only confirmed that she really wanted to disappear from his life.
Lucas.
Her voice was just as quiet, as if she was afraid that any word would destroy this fragile moment. After meeting Lucas in Chicago, Aya felt her life spinning out of control again. The whole year she had spent trying to escape from her feelings suddenly seemed lost. Meeting him awakened in her all those emotions that she tried to suppress, made her realize again how strong and painful her love for her brother was. But Aya understood that she could not afford to plunge back into the abyss from which she had barely escaped. Her move, her decision to disappear, her attempt to start a new life, all this turned out to be useless, because just one look from Lucas opened all the wounds that she had so diligently healed. Returning to her new life in Chicago, Aya felt even more devastated than before. She had a job, a new routine, a new city, But now she realized that no amount of environmental changes would help her get rid of what was happening inside her. Every thought, every action brought her back to Lucas, to their forbidden bond, which she couldn't afford. But it was unbearable to remain in this state. She knew that either she would fall back into the same pit of despair that she had been climbing out of for so long, or she needed to make a drastic change. And then she made a decision. She needed to try to build a new relationship. Aya believed that if she could distract herself, if she could transfer her emotional attachment to someone else, then maybe she could forget Lucas. It wasn't a conscious decision to love someone new, it was a decision to escape from your own feelings. She hoped that if she surrounded herself with someone who could give her care and support, she would at least temporarily find peace. At first, after returning, she threw herself into work. Her office was located in the center of Chicago, among high rises and office buildings, the bustle of big streets and endless crowds of people. It was a new environment that helped her to be distracted, at least for a while. She came to work early and left late, trying to immerse herself in cases, documents and reports, so that she didn't have time to think about Lucas. Colleagues began to notice her diligence, but no one suspected that this was an attempt to escape from herself. However, it was impossible to be distracted by work for a long time. Every evening, returning to her empty apartment, Aya found herself alone with her thoughts again and again. Loneliness became her constant companion, and no matter how she tried to fill the void with new things and tasks, her feelings for Lucas did not weaken. They were just hiding deep inside, waiting for the moment when they could reappear. One day, Aya realized that if she did not change something in her personal life, she would collapse again under the weight of these emotions. The appearance of a new person in her life was an unexpected, but at the same time a logical step. One of her colleagues was Michael, a man who had been interested in her from the very beginning of her work in the office. He was a few years older, confident, with a slight smile and a calmness that attracted others. Michael was one of those who always knows what to say to keep the conversation going, who is not afraid to joke and flirt, but does it with dignity. He had been paying attention to Aya for a long time, but she was too withdrawn to respond to his attentions. However, after meeting Lucas, when her inner world began to crumble again, Aya realized that Michael could be the one to help her restore balance. He didn't look like Lucas, and that was important to her. Aya was looking for someone who would not remind her of her brother, who would become a new page for her, and not a continuation of an old story. Michael turned out to be just such a person. Their communication began with simple, friendly conversations at work. Aya tried not to show too much interest, but Michael was persistent. He invited her to dinners, offered to help with chores, tried to be there for her when it was hard. Gradually, Aya began to notice that his presence had become a kind of salvation for her. She felt that Michael was trying to understand her, even though he didn't know all the details of her life. He didn't need to know about Lucas to be the one to help her forget about the past. After a few weeks, their communication became more personal. Michael started inviting her to dinners, offering to take a walk after work. Aya hesitated at first, but then decided that this might be her chance. She started dating Michael, hoping that this relationship could help her deal with what she felt for Lucas. Michael was caring and attentive, and Aya tried to be grateful for his attention. He didn't press her, didn't demand revelations, but she felt that he sincerely wanted to be with her. At first, their meetings were easy and casual. Michael was able to create an atmosphere of comfort, and it helped Aya relax. She began to think that maybe she could build a normal relationship with him, that Michael would be the person for her to forget about Lucas. He was different, calm, confident, without those sharp angles that had always been between her and her brother. He didn't make her feel pain or guilt, but on the contrary, he helped her to distract herself from all this. But despite all her efforts, Aya couldn't get rid of the inner feeling that her feelings for Michael were superficial. She knew she was pretending that her affection for him was more an attempt to forget about her brother than true love. Michael was kind and attentive, but every time they spent time together, Aya found herself comparing him to Lucas, and each time the comparison was not in Michael's favor. Gradually, Aya began to notice that their meetings were becoming more of a duty for her than a joy. She didn't feel the spark she was looking for. Michael was reliable and stable, but her heart remained deaf to his concern. His every gesture, every word seemed right to her, but at the same time alien. She tried to convince herself that she would eventually be able to love him, that it was only a matter of time, but her inner world remained full of doubts. Every day their relationship became more strained. Michael began to notice her detachment, her disinterest in their meetings. He didn't tell her about it directly, but Aya could see that he could feel her cold. It wasn't intentional she tried to be sincere with him, but her heart wouldn't respond. Every time Michael tried to approach her, she involuntarily pulled away, as if she was building an invisible wall between them. Several months have passed since the beginning of their relationship, and Aya realized that she could no longer pretend. She couldn't keep deceiving Michael, couldn't be with him, knowing that she would never be able to truly love him. Her feelings for Lucas had not disappeared, and no new relationship could change that fact. She understood that Michael deserved more, someone who could give him sincere love and devotion. Aya, on the other hand, could offer him nothing but an attempt to forget about her brother. The decision to end the relationship was difficult, but necessary. Aya thought about this step for a long time, not knowing how to do the right thing. She didn't want to hurt Michael, because he really was a good man. But the continuation of this relationship became unbearable for her. She felt guilty about him, about herself, and even about Lucas. All her attempts to escape from her feelings were in vain. Finally, she decided that she had to be honest. One evening, when they were sitting in a cafe, Aya gathered her strength and told Michael that she could no longer continue this relationship. It was a difficult conversation, but she knew it had to be done. Michael accepted her decision with dignity, although it was obvious that he was in pain. He had long felt her detachment and understood that something was wrong between them. Aya did not explain everything to him in detail, did not talk about Lucas. It was her personal struggle, and she didn't want to involve Michael in this story. After the breakup with Michael, Aya was left alone again. She realized that no new relationship could stifle her feelings for Lucas. Michael was just a temporary distraction, an attempt to find peace in someone else's arms, but her heart remained true to the one she couldn't have. This realization was painful, but it gave her an understanding that her attempts to escape from herself were doomed to failure from the very beginning. Now that the relationship with Michael is over, Aya finds herself facing the same choice as a year ago. She could keep trying to forget about Lucas, or she needed to change something in her life. It's been exactly a year since Aya made one of the most difficult decisions of her life to sever all ties with Lucas and leave. This year turned out to be both an emotional torture for her and a time when she was trying to find herself. Since she left her hometown, leaving behind all the memories of her family, brother and their difficult relationship, her life has turned into a series of attempts to move on. Aya threw all her strength into starting a new life in Chicago, both physically and emotionally, but all this time she carried unhealed wounds. At first, Aya believed that time could heal her mental injuries, that with each new day her feelings for Lucas would weaken, as is usually the case with past relationships. She hoped that her attachment to him, as well as her inner struggle, would disappear as she moved away from him both physically and emotionally. But despite the move, the new job, even the attempt to build a relationship with Michael, her heart was still in chaos. Feelings for my brother have not disappeared, they have not gone away, and have not weakened. They became a part of her being, something she had to live with, even if she tried to ignore it. Aya got used to the routine of her new life in Chicago, but behind this external stabilization there was still the same internal struggle. She worked, tried to be as busy as possible, attended training sessions, met with colleagues, and sometimes even participated in some social events. However, every evening when she returned to her apartment, she was left alone with her thoughts again. Her apartment, although comfortable and equipped for comfort, was cold and devoid of what would make it a home. She didn't feel safe or at peace here because she knew that her heart was in the past, in her hometown, somewhere near Lucas. Over time, Aya realized that running away didn't solve her problems. She couldn't forget Lucas, no matter how hard she tried. All her attempts to repress her feelings proved futile, and she continued to live in a state of emotional isolation. The same contradictory feelings were still boiling inside her: love, guilt, fear. At some point, she realized that she might never be able to completely free herself from this burden. The year flew by unnoticed. One part of her life was immersed in work and business, the other remained in the shadows, imprisoned in the past. Each new day seemed to her the same as the previous one. Everything flowed in the same rhythm: the subway, the office, training, grocery shopping, rare meetings with colleagues. At first she felt like she was in a cocoon in this routine, which protected her from pain, but soon realized that this cocoon had become her prison. It seemed to her that she was stuck in an endless circle of monotony, and no external changes could change her inner state. Autumn, which brought coolness to Chicago, also became a time for Aya when she increasingly thought that it was time for her to return to her hometown. and not because she missed home or people. It was something deeper. She felt that she needed to go back to finally close this painful issue with Lucas. The internal conflict was still gnawing at her, and the longer she put off facing the past, the more intense her suffering became. One day, she received an invitation to a family event, their parents' wedding anniversary. It was an event that Aya couldn't ignore. Every year, their entire extended family gathered together to celebrate this date, and the absence of one of the children was always perceived as something strange. Aya understood that if she didn't come, it would cause too many questions from her relatives, and they were the last thing she wanted right now. At the same time, she knew that Lucas would be at this event. His presence would rekindle the feelings she had tried so hard to bury this year. But it was impossible to avoid this meeting. The anniversary was an important family event, and its absence would be a signal that something was wrong. Aya thought for a long time about what to do, but eventually decided to go. She understood that sooner or later she would have to face the past, and it was impossible to avoid it anymore. Being face to face with Lucas again was scary, but also inevitable. This fear did not leave her all the days before the trip, but Aya knew that now she had to be strong. You can't run away anymore. The journey home was painful for her. The city that used to seem so familiar has now become a stranger. Every street, every corner was a reminder of the days when she and Lucas were inseparable. Memories piled up one after another, and Aya could hardly contain her emotions. The same anxiety that had been visiting her so often lately began to grow inside her again. She had a meeting with Lucas ahead of her, and although she didn't know how he felt now, the thought of having to see him again made her heart ache with pain and anticipation. When she arrived home, her parents greeted her joyfully, as if nothing had happened, as if this year of torment had never existed. For them, Aya was a daughter who just went to another city to build her life, and they didn't know anything about what was going on inside her. This allowed her to hold her face and pretend that everything was fine, although every look at family photos, every conversation about her childhood only intensified her inner struggle. On the day of the family holiday, Aya felt like she was going to be executed. Parents and relatives have already gathered at the country house, where such events have always been held. The noise of conversation, laughter, and lightness of the atmosphere seemed to contrast with her inner state. She tried to keep up conversations, smile, answer questions, but her whole being was focused on waiting for the moment when she would see Lucas. Deep down, she knew that their meeting was inevitable, but she did not know how to withstand it. Lucas arrived later than the others. When Aya saw him, her heart stopped. Time seemed to have stopped. He was the same as she remembered him, but there was something new in his gaze, something that said that this year had changed him as much as it had changed her. He was restrained, friendly, but behind this external calmness there were emotions that she immediately recognized. Aya avoided looking into his eyes, tried to keep her distance, but every time they happened to be near, her breathing quickened and her thoughts became confused. Lucas noticed her tension too. He seemed to be trying to give her space, but at the same time his presence was palpable. Their unspoken bond, despite all their efforts, did not disappear. She was just waiting in the wings to remind herself of herself again. And now the hour has come. Throughout the evening, Aya felt like everything inside her was preparing for some crucial moment. As the evening drew to a close, Aya could no longer stay in the house. She went outside to get some fresh air and calm her nerves. It was quiet outside. The lanterns were shining all around, and a light breeze brought cold air with it. She leaned against the railing of the terrace and closed her eyes, trying to cope with the hurricane of emotions that raged inside her. Lucas followed her. She felt his presence long before she heard his footsteps. As he approached, the silence between them became almost palpable. It wasn't their first silent encounter, but now, after everything that had happened, it felt different. There was more to this silence than just words. There were so many things they hadn't said to each other this year. Words lost their meaning because feelings spoke for them. They both stood on the terrace, lost in their thoughts, and it seemed that this moment could last forever. Something broke inside Aya. She could no longer run away from this pain, from these feelings. And although she didn't know what she would say or do next, one thing became obvious to her: this meeting was just the beginning. The beginning of something that could change everything, but what exactly, Aya couldn't know. After that fateful meeting with Lucas on a family holiday, Aya returned to Chicago with even more confusion than before. Meeting her brother, who for a year remained a ghost of her past, completely knocked her off balance. Aya understood that a lot had changed this year, but one thing remained unchanged: her feelings for Lucas were still just as strong. if not stronger. She couldn't ignore this fact no matter how hard she tried. Trying to build a new life, a new relationship, and forget about what had happened between them now seemed naive and useless to her. When Aya returned to Chicago, her internal struggle escalated to the limit. Michael, her new partner, had long suspected that something was wrong. Their relationship, which at first seemed like an opportunity for her to find salvation, began to crumble long before this trip. But after returning from her hometown, Aya became even more detached and withdrawn. Michael, although he was a patient and empathetic person, could not help but notice that there was more and more distance between them. He tried not to ask unnecessary questions, hoping that she would come to him with an explanation, but Aya was too confused in her feelings to open up to him. Michael was the one who gave Aya a chance to start a new life, who tried to fill the void she carried inside herself after breaking up with Lucas. He was kind, reliable, attentive, all the things that seemed to help Aya forget about the past. But instead of being a salvation for her, Michael turned into a reminder that her heart did not belong to him. With each passing day, Aya realized more and more that her feelings for Michael could not compare to what she felt for Lucas. And the more she tried to ignore it, the stronger her inner conflict became. After returning from her hometown, Aya felt as if she was divided. On the one hand, she tried to convince herself that she had to continue her relationship with Michael, that this was the right step, that he cared about her and could give her the stability she so lacked. On the other hand, every moment she spent with him only increased her pain and guilt. Her heart did not respond to his caresses, his words, his attempts to get closer to her. His every touch seemed alien to her, and she felt more and more that she was betraying not only Michael, but also herself. Aya found herself thinking back to Lucas more and more often. The memories of her brother became even brighter after that meeting, and every time she was with Michael, her thoughts invariably drifted into the past. It created unbearable tension. She tried to maintain the appearance of a normal relationship, but her every gesture, every word became more and more mechanical. Michael could feel it, and although he tried not to push her, the tension between them was building. The job that used to be a refuge for Aya has now become a source of additional stress. It was becoming increasingly difficult for her to concentrate on tasks, and each new task seemed too much for her. She began to come to work more tired and annoyed, and her results began to drop. Aya understood that her internal conflict was destroying not only her personal life, but also her professional one. Colleagues began to notice her detachment, but no one dared to ask directly what was happening to her. Gradually, Aya became more and more withdrawn into herself. Her meetings with Michael became rare, and even when they were together, she tried to avoid too deep conversations. She couldn't tell him what was going on in her soul, couldn't admit that her heart belonged to another person, and even more so that this person was her brother. She felt like she was ruining their relationship, but she couldn't do anything about it. Michael, in turn, began to feel a growing alienation. He saw that Aya was no longer open to him, that she was withdrawing more and more into herself. At first he tried to support her, not to push her, but over time his patience began to run out. He didn't understand what was going on, and this only increased his frustration. It seemed to him that Aya was hiding something, that she was struggling with something important, but could not share it with him. Michael tried to have frank conversations, but each time Aya skillfully evaded the answers, which further deepened the gap between them. One day, when they were having dinner together, the tension reached its peak. Aya hardly ate, her thoughts were far away, and Michael, feeling this, could not stand it and began to ask questions. He asked her directly what was going on, why she had become so detached, why she avoided conversations and meetings. Aya understood that she couldn't continue this relationship anymore, but she still couldn't find the strength to tell the truth. She couldn't explain to Michael that her whole life, all her feelings, were locked in one person she couldn't have. Michael was too good a man to deserve such pain. He really cared about her, tried to be there for her, to support her, but Aya knew she couldn't give him what he wanted. She felt guilty that she had continued this relationship, knowing that she could not be truly sincere with him. Every new day with Michael was a challenge for her, because she saw how hard he was trying, but her heart remained cold. For several weeks after that conversation, the relationship between them hung in the balance. Aya understood that Michael was expecting an explanation from her, that he wanted to know why she had become so distant. But she couldn't tell him anything. Her feelings for Lucas had grown even stronger, and no new relationship could change that fact. Each new meeting with Michael turned into torment. She felt that she was deceiving him, that she was betraying their relationship, and this feeling intensified her inner struggle. Aya soon realized that she could no longer continue this deception. Her relationship with Michael was built on false hopes, on trying to numb her pain and forget about the past, but it all turned out to be useless. She couldn't love him the way he deserved to be loved. It hurt her that she had to hurt him, but she knew that continuing this relationship would be unfair to both of them. The decision to break off relations with Michael was inevitable, but Aya could not find the strength to take this step for a long time. She was tormented by the thought that she would destroy something that could have been good. But she also understood that if she continued to live in this state, she would completely lose herself. Her inner conflict became so unbearable that every morning when she woke up, she felt the weight of this decision hanging over her. Finally, one evening when they met after work, Aya decided it was time to end this relationship. She knew that Michael didn't deserve to be a part of this struggle that was going on inside her. They were sitting at a table in her apartment, and the atmosphere was tense. Aya gathered all her strength to tell him that she could no longer continue the relationship. She didn't go into details, didn't explain to him everything that was going on in her soul, but Michael understood her without words. After she told him of her decision, silence fell between them. Michael was disappointed, but he had long felt that this relationship would not last. He didn't know what exactly Aya was hiding from him, but he could see that her heart belonged to someone else. He was wise enough not to ask too many questions and sensitive enough to understand her. Their breakup was painful, but inevitable. They both understood that their relationship was doomed from the very beginning. After that evening, Michael left her life as quietly as he had appeared. They didn't see each other anymore, and Aya was left alone with her thoughts and feelings. She knew she had made the right choice, but it did not bring her relief. Now that her relationship with Michael was over, her heart finally returned to Lucas. She realized that no new relationship could help her forget how she felt about her brother. This year was spent trying to escape from herself, but in the end she returned to the same place where she started. Now Aya faced an even more difficult choice. Her attempt to start a new life had failed, and she needed to decide what to do next. After Aya broke off her relationship with Michael and was left alone with herself, it became clear to her that her attempts to escape from her feelings for Lucas were in vain. She had tried many times to convince herself that loving her own brother was something that could be suppressed, forgotten, or replaced. However, now, after all her attempts to build a normal relationship had failed, she had to admit to herself that the feeling she had for Lucas had not disappeared, despite all her efforts. Aya's been trying to avoid this truth for a long time. All attempts to distract one's self-work, moving, new relationships turned out to be only temporary ways to hide real emotions. But every time she was alone, these feelings surfaced. Her love for Lucas was deeper than she was willing to admit. She could not be drowned out by new impressions or go so far as to forget him. It was a part of her very being, something that couldn't just be erased from her life. When the relationship with Michael ended, Aya began to realize that further escape from her feelings for Lucas did not make sense. Throughout the year she spent away from him, her heart remained attached to the moment when she realized that her love for him went beyond brotherly. It became clear to her that now that she had done everything possible to build a new life, she no longer had the opportunity and desire to continue running away. These realizations became a turning point for Aya. Before, it was easier for her to think that all this could be fixed, that her feelings were a temporary insanity that would pass by itself. But now she knew that wasn't the case. She no longer had any illusions her love for Lucas was not just an emotional outburst, but something much deeper and more lasting than she could have imagined. And now that there was no need to pretend to herself and others anymore, Aya realized that the only way forward was to admit her feelings and make a choice, no matter how difficult it might be. However, it is one thing to realize your love, and quite another to figure out what to do with it next. Aya thought about it for a long time. She understood that a relationship with Lucas was not just an emotional or moral challenge. It was a step that could destroy their lives, bring pain and suffering not only to them, but also to their family. Society, environment, friends, all these people will never understand and accept that Aya and Lucas decided to be together. And yet, despite these fears, she felt that she could no longer ignore her heart. One of the most difficult parts of this decision was the realization that admitting her feelings to Lucas would be tantamount to stepping into the abyss. She knew that if she opened up to him, it could change everything, their relationship, their lives. She could lose him forever if he rejected her confession. But at the same time, Aya understood that if she continued to live in a state of suppressed emotions, she would completely destroy herself. Her life had become empty without Lucas, and she couldn't live in that emptiness anymore. Aya had been preparing for a long time to talk to Lucas. She wasn't sure if he felt the same way, although there was hope in her soul. Their last meeting on a family holiday had given her reason to think that he too felt something more than brotherly affection for her. His look, his behavior, all this indicated that he too was going through something deep and painful. But how do you know if he is ready for this? Is he ready to admit his feelings? Or had he already accepted that they could never be together? Finally, after much thought, Aya decided that she needed to talk to Lucas. It wasn't easy, but she realized that she couldn't live in a state of uncertainty anymore. She needed to know the truth, even if it turned out to be painful. She knew it was a risk, a huge risk, but it was the only way out. It was impossible to live in constant struggle with oneself. Aya chose a neutral place to meet their old cafe, where they often sat together when everything was simpler and more innocent. This place was a symbol of peace and friendship for them, and she hoped that this choice would help ease the conversation. Her heart was beating so hard that she thought she could hear it beating in her ears when she entered the cafe and saw Lucas at the table. Lucas, as always, looked calm, but there was anxiety in his eyes. He had been waiting for this conversation, as had she. Aya noticed how he tensed when he saw her, but made no move to hide his feelings. Their eyes met in silence, and there was more in that silence than words could express. Aya gathered all her courage to start a conversation. She knew that this would be the most difficult moment in her life, but she understood that if she didn't do it now, she would never be able to free herself from the pain that she carried inside herself. She began to speak, and with every word she uttered, it became easier for her. Her heart was open, and she no longer tried to hide her feelings. She told Lucas everything about how long she had been fighting with herself, how she had tried to forget him, how she had tried to build a new life. But nothing had helped. She spoke for a long time, not looking into his eyes, afraid to see his reaction. Aya knew she could lose him forever, but this was the only chance to tell the truth. She told him about her love, about how she suffered because this love was forbidden, but at the same time she could not control it. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the cafe. Lucas was silent for a long time. He was looking at her, and Aya couldn't understand what he was feeling. Her heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was about to stop. But instead of rejecting her, Lucas started talking. He told her about how he felt all this time, about how he also tried to fight his feelings, how he didn't know how to do the right thing. He was afraid that if he opened up, he would lose her forever, and that's why he also chose the path of silence. Lucas confessed that his love for her was as painful as hers. He also tried to start a new life, to forget it, but nothing helped. Every attempt seemed futile to him, because his heart always returned to Aya. This year was as empty for him as it was for her. He realized that their feelings were mutual, and the realization came as a shock to both of them. None of them expected that the truth would be so devastating, and at the same time, liberating. Now that everything was said, Aya and Lucas were faced with a choice that would change their lives. They both understood that the relationship between them could not be accepted by society or their family. Their love was forbidden, and any steps towards being together would be met with condemnation and rejection. They will have to live in constant shadow, hiding their feelings from everyone. It was a huge risk, and they both knew it. But despite all their fears and misgivings, they realized that they could no longer continue to live pretending that their feelings did not exist. They were both willing to take this risk because their love was stronger than any inhibitions. It was their decision to give these feelings a chance, despite all the consequences. Aya and Lucas decided that they would no longer live in denial of their emotions. They knew that difficulties awaited them, but they also knew that they could cope with them if they were together. It was the most difficult decision of their lives, but now that all the cards were out, they were determined to go all the way. There was an unknown ahead of them, but they were ready for it, because they understood that their love was worth fighting for. Now Aya and Lucas were no longer alone in their struggle. They decided to give their feelings a chance, despite all the risks. They had a long and difficult road ahead of them, but they were ready to walk it together.